Well, good evening, everyone. Nice to welcome all of you this evening. I'm glad that, you're all Canadians, so you came out. The roads are good. It's not that cold. It's warming up, yeah. It's great. In any event, welcome to our series of lectures. It's a three-part series, and this is an opportunity to delve more deeply into Hinduism. And we're very pleased that everyone's here and continuing to be part of this very unique and innovative program that is intended to increase our religious literacy. And we have a wonderful teacher who's enabling us to do that as we focus on Hinduism this year. So it's a pleasure to welcome again Dr. Tinu Ruparel from the University of Calgary. He's the Associate Professor in Indian and Comparative Philosophy in the Department of Classics and Religion. So we have more of his bio here, but I want to get to the material. So welcome again.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming. Before I forget, I do need to make sure I thank people. Every time I speak, I always sing praises of this program. I think it's so wonderful. But I don't think I've singled out Lil Faider particularly for her generosity and vision in funding this great program, of which I'm so lucky to be a part. So with that out of the way, let's move on. So there are three lectures that I'm going to cover on a Hindu view of life. This is not the Hindu view of life, but a particular way of understanding this diverse faith. So today I'll spend some time talking about beginnings and foundations, how Hinduism, as we understand it now, came to be. Next week we'll look at some of the developments into what we call classical Hinduism, and the idea that nothing really is thrown away, but that it all kind of accretes into various layers. And so next week we'll do a little bit of digging into those layers to see what we can find. And then finally we'll try to bring it up to date to talk about how Hinduism is practiced and lived today. Now, I should say a couple of caveats. One, I'm trained as a philosopher, not a historian or a sociologist. So some of this stuff is really, in many ways, not my subject specialty, although I will try to make sure that I'm presenting to you what modern contemporary scholars have, in some ways, the state of the art in terms of modern scholarship. Where things are more philosophical, I'll certainly try to express more of my own ideas and my own interpretations there. All right, so with that little caveat, let me give you another one. And I should say that some of you probably have already heard some of this in the brunch sessions that we've had. I apologize for that. There is new stuff, so don't worry. But I thought I better repeat a little bit just in case some of you who are new may not have seen it. The caveat really is that if anything is true in Hinduism, its opposite is also true. And in that sense, what I am trying to present is just that, a Hindu view of life. There will be other people who present rather different views. I would have thought that we would overlap in a great many things, but given everybody's particular perspective and their particular way of seeing things, I cannot say that this is the way of Hindu or the Hindu view of life. And even the ways that I express things, there's a lot of debate out there. I was reading a little bit about some early archaeology this afternoon, and I was struck by the depth and breadth of disagreement among scholars who are studying putatively the same place and the same times. So they've got the same data, but it can be read in so many different ways. So with that little caveat passed, let me start looking at how Hinduism could be understood. So first of all, it is a tradition of many and the one. And we talked a little bit about this earlier. It's a tradition that I want to suggest is in tension. There's constantly pulls towards the fringes, as it were, to local traditions, to minority traditions, and there's also a push, as it were, to central tenets, central beliefs and practices. And in the history of this tradition, those tensions have rarely ever been dissolved. They have rarely ever been collapsed in a serious way. There may have been times and in different places or particular locations, as it were, where Hinduism became to mean one thing. That is, it became coalesced around perhaps the views of the local prince or king or monarch. But once that monarchy left, the tradition pulls it back out into this kind of tension where there's always a mix between the many and the one. So we have, for instance, many deities in Hinduism, but there's one ultimate reality, which is called Brahman. There's many texts. In fact, if you tried to collect all of the sacred scriptures of Hinduism together, you'd get a pretty large shelf full of materials that are all considered to be revelation. We'll get to this in a little while. Revelation, the Hindu or the Sanskrit term, is called Shruti. There are many beliefs and practices, but I want to suggest there is one kind of core body or not essence so much, but maybe kind of life sap in this tree. Many truths and one truth, one big truth, which most Hindus will term Sanatana Dharma. It literally means just the eternal teaching, the eternal Dharma. So again, I've shown this picture before. One way to think about Hinduism is this kind of forest idea. This is in fact a forest that is in reality just one tree. It's the banyan tree in Calcutta. And it's a good model for Hinduism. It looks like an overgrown forest with many perspectives, many trunks. But in fact, there is one life sap flowing through all of it. And it's sometimes difficult to identify what that sap is. So here's my attempt to try to describe that. So today I'm going to just be looking at formations and foundations. We'll start with some basic definitions about Hinduism, and then talk a little bit about the scriptural sources, some of the texts that we look to give us some of the basic ideas and practices. And finally, I'll spend a little bit of time just talking about the basic concepts, because we'll need some of those in later lectures. So let's look at definitions first of all. Hinduism is best understood as a kind of umbrella term for a wide variety, a diverse collection of variously local or broader traditions. The term Hinduism, in fact, isn't really something we get from Hindus. It's a term that scholars, and really in the 19th century in Europe and the West, we came up with this term Hinduism. And when you actually try to isolate what Hinduism is, really all you can do is point at all of these various traditions, right? So the problem of understanding traditions is always quite difficult. As I said, Hinduism is a 19th century term. It's not a term that Hindus prior to the 19th century would have even recognized. And it really is, in a sense, a term that was imposed onto this broad collection of religious traditions, beliefs, and practices. The problem of understanding other traditions is that we, from outside of the tradition, always want to see in the other tradition what we recognize, what we already understand to be our tradition. So we look for analogs and things that we can easily translate. And the history of understanding Hinduism is actually littered with false translations and misunderstandings, because this is how, and this is not just from the West to the East, but every tradition will try to learn about another tradition by using its own built-in categories. So if in our tradition we have an idea of a theistic God, then of course, if we're going to find the religion of somebody else, we'll be looking for some analog to a theistic God. If we have a view of heaven and hell or the afterlife, then we would be looking for that in the other tradition. But sometimes that trips us up. And we'll get to that other times. So we have to be aware of these simple translations. One of the things I think that is important to think about as far as Hinduism, it's often said by Hindus, and no less than one of the great philosophers of Indian traditions in the 20th century, a fellow named Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, who was a philosopher who ended up being the president of India, so there's some hope for us yet, right? He actually said Hinduism isn't a religion, it's a way of life. And many Hindus that you might talk to will say something like this. And there's some truth and some falsity to this. Every religious tradition is also a way of life. So to say that it's not a religion but a way of life isn't really saying much, because every faith, every tradition institutes some kind of form of life. However, it's true for Hindus in that it is not an orthodox religion. It's not creedal. You don't have to believe particular things, or you don't have to confess particular things in order to be a Hindu. You do generally have to follow some set of practices, rituals, and certain kinds of forms of life, ways of being human, right? That might be better understood as what he's talking about, ways of life. It's not a creedal religion like some Western traditions, for instance, like Christianity. So let's look at these terms, Hindu, Hindus, and Hinduism. Again, I've pointed some of this out before. The term Hindu literally just refers to a geographical area. And the river there is the Indus, but the earlier forms of the word was actually Sind or Sindhu. And so the river Sind or Sindhu eventually got anglicized to Indus. And so the Indian subcontinent is that land beyond the Indus River. And Hindus, therefore, were those people beyond the Sind, the Sindhu, the Indus River. And Indus eventually, again, further got transformed into Hindu or Hindus. So the term, as I said, is not really native. It's imposed by outsiders, right? And we should, therefore, be aware that when we talk about Hinduism, the term really has some colonial connotations, some of which many Indians, many Hindu followers will really bridle against, and for good reason, I suppose. So for them, their term for their tradition, as I said, would be Dharma, Sanatana Dharma, perhaps, the eternal Dharma. And we'll talk a little bit about Dharma later. So what about the origins? Well, traditionally, Hindus would understand their tradition as being beginningless. The Sanskrit term is aparushaya, beginningless, and in fact, endless. And this is because they have a cyclical view of time. Time doesn't begin at one point and end in another. Creation didn't begin at one point and will come to an end in some other point. It's a circle. And a beginning is always going to circle back to some destruction or ending, which is itself a further beginning. So the tradition of Dharma is really beginningless in this sense, right? It's never not been the case. Now, of course, that is the Hindu way of looking at things. However, scholars will always want to see some sense in which the form of Hinduism that we see now did come into being, right? They're always going to look for some causal factors or origins. But this is really difficult because the traditions are very old. The records are very sparse. The tradition is quite old because we don't actually have very much. It's difficult to get at all of this because the archaeology and the documentary evidence is really quite sparse. The ways early Hindus wrote things down were on dry palm leaves, little rectangles of palms, and they would use a lemon juice or an acidic kind of ink to write their letters on it. As the acid would dry, it would leave a brown mark on these palm leaves. And so the actual leaves, you would see it in these little rectangles, which they would sew together and they would flip up. Now, of course, palm leaves are not going to be the most durable material, right? In fact, if you go to some places in India, there's vast numbers of these palm leaf manuscripts all slowly decaying. And they are at a rush trying to scan and preserve some of this. We, in fact, only have access today to about 15% of all extant Hindu scriptural material. There's 85% out there in these palm leaf manuscripts, which almost nobody has seen. Right? So it's a huge, huge corpus of material, and we only have a very small bit of it. Secondly, the archaeological evidence is also quite difficult to get at. There is quite a bit of archaeological work going on in India at the time, even now, but because it's such an old and frankly crowded place, it's really hard to do archaeology without having to remove villages that have been there for 1,000 years. Who wants to do that? It's really difficult to actually do any kinds of digs. If you've gone to Delhi, all around Delhi there are archaeological digs in very small little pockets. It's because, of course, Delhi is a very old city and there's at least 11 layers of civilizations there. But it's really hard to get at because you actually have to displace so many people in order to do that archaeology. So again, it's quite difficult to get at all of this evidence. The other thing we should probably be careful about is this presupposition or this sort of predilection that we have to looking for sort of beginnings and founders, looking for if we find the Ur text or the Ur tradition or the beginning of something, somehow that's going to explain everything else. Well, if you think a little bit about it, it doesn't necessarily explain everything else, right? But again, because we in the West have a more linear view of time, the beginning seems to be the kind of key to understanding a lot of what happens after. But if people think about it in cyclical time, beginnings are really not that important, right? And so again, that probably answers one of the reasons why historical documentation, particularly in ancient times, was not particularly important to Hindus. If you have a cyclical view of time, then writing down everything from the beginning is actually not that important because you know it's going to kind of come back, right? So there is a relative lack of historical interest in the ancient periods. You get it later on, right? So again, it's a difficult place to, reasons why it's difficult to really figure out what the origins are. There are also sort of nationalist and anti-Orientalist issues that we have to consider. And as I said, because the idea of Hinduism is sort of imported, there's a lot of political and nationalistic issues that we have to get around when we look at the interpretation of ancient scriptures or ancient sites. We'll get to a little bit of that, a little more of that in a minute. All right. So from what is sort of the state of the art in terms of scholarship in the area, the Hindu traditions, what we call the Hindu traditions, really began somewhere between 6000 and 2750 BCE, before the Common Era. Now, we say it's such a broad period. The Harappan civilization, we know, we can find archaeological evidence as far back as 6000 BCE. There are seals, there are pottery shards, there are certain tools that we have been able to find. Now, those are really early and not very full. As you go into further into the future, by 2750, you get a very developed and full understanding of the Harappan civilization. By that point, you have two great cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, along the Indus River, and a vast number of smaller settlements, towns, and villages. This, we can see, is an agrarian society, a farming society. Possibly there's some goddess worship because we've found various small icons of what looks to be goddesses, although there are lots of images of male gods as well. And interestingly, some of these images, some of these artifacts seem to be precursors to later Hindu deities as well. So I'll show you some pictures here. In terms of ancient archaeology, we tend to see 4 major centers, river centers. Of course, there's Mesopotamia and Egypt, there's India, and then there's China. And along these rivers, you get ancient civilizations, cities, and cultures developing. All right? Here's a picture of the Indus, right? And that green area is roughly the area of the Harappan civilization. There are, you can see where Harappa is, right? Mohenjo-Daro closer to the sea there. Lothal, which I'll show you some pictures from later. Taxila is an interesting one because it was known at least as far as 600 BCE as a center of learning. Some Indians would consider that to be the world's first university. And we do have records in various scriptures of learned people meeting in Taxila to debate and learn from each other. If you go to Taxila now, you see the ruins, and it does sort of look like a meeting area at least. It doesn't look so much like a university in the sense of scholars living there, but it certainly looked like it was a center of learning. And again, here's a picture of all of the various different sites that people have found. So into Pakistan and Gujarat and Punjab in India. And you can see there's quite a lot of sites, quite a lot of villages and towns. And these have all been actually dug, right, to various levels. So here's what Harappa now sort of looks like. I'm sorry it's not a particularly good picture, but Harappa was a city possibly up to the size of 100,000 people, which is a very big city in ancient times. It was laid out in a grid fashion. It had some of the digs or the little channels that you see were actually dug up sewers. So it had a sewer system. This was probably around 2700 BCE. So we don't know a lot about these cultures. We can see their artifacts. We can look at their pottery and jewelry and things like that. We can look at their alphabet, but we don't know what it means. Nobody has been able to decipher the language. And so much of this stuff is still outside of our purview. Again, you may not be able to see it, but there's bricks there. There's various square and rectangular structures. The bricks are probably at least around 2,600 years old. Brick making was actually a really important skill and technology at the time. It takes an awful lot of energy to create bricks. And so the large number of bricks found, again, indicates a society, a city, which had a lot of energy, a lot of excess materials and wealth to create all of these bricks. So a lot of the structures will have been built by brick. We find these kinds of seals. This is a clay seal depicting what we now refer to as Pashupati, a Sanskrit term for the Lord of Beasts. And this picture is of a sitting man with his horns on his head, and around the seal you see various depictions of animals. Now, later on you'll see, in our next lecture, we'll see how this early figure, maybe a divine figure, can be traced in its lineage towards later classical Hindu deities. Right? So we have some connections, I think, to suggest that these might have been divine seals. So Pashupati is that was found at Harappa. Here's another place, one that I was able to go visit last year, a place called Lothal. It's closer to the desert in the state of Gujarat. And one of the seals that is very famous came from Lothal, the one on the left there showing a bull or a cow. And you can see the symbols right at the top, part of their alphabet, part of their language. And as I say, nobody's yet been able to decipher this. So there's something for you to do, some homework for you, is to try to decipher this. In Lothal, these are the remains of the settlements as they are now. You can see again lots of brickwork. Right here is really quite a remarkable feature. It was a port. Now it's kind of filled in with sand, but at some point Lothal, for various environmental reasons, the rivers dried up and the port, of course, went away, as it were, right? That square or big rectangular thing is about the size of a football field. It's actually lined with about 50,000 fired bricks, right? And they're all kiln fired, and they have to be so that they can hold water, right? So it's an enormous space. It would have been a fairly important trade center for them to have put that much energy into creating a port with that many bricks, right? So we have some indications of the kind of breadth and depth of this society. They had a lot of energy. They had a lot of resources. They had a thriving trade around the Indus, but also along the Arabian Peninsula and even into the northern part of Africa. Again, this is stuff that I'm trying to relay to you. It's not my area, but I have seen some of this, and it really is quite remarkable. Here's some more things you see in Lothal. That's a bronze cast of the seal that I showed you. There's a lot of beadwork, a lot of jewelry that they've been able to find. And Lothal is interesting because, as a friend of mine, a colleague of mine has told me, the beads are really quite sophisticated. I don't know anything about beadwork, but she tells me that when you create a bead, you have to drill a hole through it. And the most sophisticated way of doing it is to use 2 drills to go from both sides. You get a better product, and you are less likely to break the beads. If you think about it, the drill bit has to be slightly wedge-shaped in order to work. If you drill one side all the way through, it's likely that the edge closest to you is going to break. So the way they have to do it is use 2 drill bits to go and meet exactly in the middle. So that's actually quite a sophisticated tool. It's one that in Europe, that kind of drilling didn't really take or didn't start to really develop until about the 15th century. So these guys were quite a ways ahead of their time in many ways. Here's Mohenjo-Daro, and this is a bronze cast of a dancing girl. A number of different seals. You can see what Mohenjo-Daro actually sort of looks like now. This is a very well preserved site. And you also have some seals, and I put those 2 up for specifically. You can see how you have a kind of proto cross there, and then the swastika. Now, the swastika, of course, has lots of very negative connotations now, but it's an incredibly old symbol. It's seen in the Harappan civilization, and you will see it all over India. So if you would ever go to visit there, and even in temples outside of India, you might see lots of swastikas. And of course, for many of us, this is a horrendous symbol. But what I wanted to point out is that, at least for the Harappans, for the early Hindus, the swastika really is a symbol of kind of cyclical wholeness. It's got 4 sides, sort of pointing to the 4 cardinal directions. It's a kind of cyclical movement, again, kind of highlighting the cyclical view of time. And it's actually seen to be quite an auspicious or quite an important symbol. So again, we do have to be careful, again, when we look at Indian symbols or Hindu symbols, Indian art, their icons, we have to be careful about how we interpret them. All right, so those are some of the early archaeological kinds of things to look at in terms of how Hinduism, or what we now term Hinduism, developed. There's an important theory that gets discussed in this context, sometimes called the Aryan invasion theory, but more properly it's the Aryan migration theory. And again, the term Aryan is a very loaded term. Arya literally means noble, and it probably came from Indo-Iranian sources in the location of Iran or Turkey. In fact, Aryan is where we get the term Iran from. And so the Aryan people, the noble ones as they called themselves, it is thought may have migrated from the Turkey-Iran area both east and west through Europe and down into the Indian continent. And we have some evidence for this. First of all, we know that the ancient Aryans were a horse-based nomadic people. They probably suffered a certain kind of environmental crisis in their area and moved away for looking for more resources. They brought with them their language, of course, their traditions, their scriptures, and we have some connections from India to these early Aryan people, mostly through literature, mostly through finding similar root words and similar deities mentioned in some of their early scriptures as well as some of the Indian early scriptures. Now, that's not to say that Hinduism was imported into India. It's probably much more complicated. However, we can't deny that there are some similarities between some of the northern Indian scriptures and some of the Iranian scriptures or the early Persian scriptures. We can also point out that some of those same linguistic connections are found between these early Iranian people as well as some pockets through Europe. There are some linguistic connections between, for instance, Irish Gaelic and some of the early Persian scriptures, as well as possibly Catalan, possibly some of the Basque languages. It may well have even connected up with the Ugaritic sources that you see in Hungarian and Finnish. So in the early 20th century, there was a lot of debate and a lot of discussion about how these languages all seem to have similar words for similar things, that they seem to have references even to similar parts of geography. So you have, for instance, references in some of the early Iranian texts to what appears to be the Indus River, because it describes the ways in which that delta seems to flow together. So again, there are arguments there, but it's, I think, best to say that it's pretty indeterminate at this stage. Scholars still debate this. There's a lot of discussion, but it's not clear that this theory really does hold. Yet, there's some really interesting data to look at there. All right, so as I said, it's a horse-based culture. It's nomadic. There is perhaps even linguistic evidence to look at, possibly even Proto-Indo-European language connections between all the way from Ireland to China. And there are, as I said, some mention of Hindu deities and Indian geography in some old Persian texts. The idea might have been that they slowly migrated east and west towards the Indian subcontinent, and this was probably after the decrease of the Harappan civilization. So the Harappan civilization really got to its pinnacle around 2700, 2600, and then slowly started to wane. The migration theory they suggest is around 1200 to 1000 BC. And what we probably have in Hinduism now is some synthesis, some mixture of Aryan and Harappan religious traditions mixed in with, in fact, some of the more indigenous traditions of the continent. So I've put all of this out there. There's a lot of debate. I don't want to suggest that this is how it actually is, but I thought I'd better at least express what the debate is so that you know when you hear these things that this is what they're talking about. So let's look at some of the scriptural sources. We have stable scriptures around 1200 to 1500 BC. Those are the earliest stable sources that we have. Those aren't necessarily written texts, but we know for various linguistic and cultural archaeological reasons that the texts that they were talking about that turned into the earliest texts were probably stabilized and came into a kind of stable form or an ossified form around this time. The oral tradition is probably much older, maybe as far as 6000 BC. There are overlapping references to, as I mentioned, these texts from the Indo-Iranian text, the Avesta, which is one of the earlier texts of the Iranian area. It's one of the texts for Zoroastrians. And you see some overlapping references to some of the early Indian texts. Again, all of this is still part of, there's a lot of politics involved here in terms of colonialism. And I haven't really mentioned yet the idea that these Harappans, these Indo-Aryans, didn't just kind of exist in the Indus River and move down from the sort of Central European area into a kind of empty space. The people who were already there probably had a culture based on what we now see as Tamil, and they are often referred to now as Dravidians. So the Tamil-based languages are called Dravidian languages. And so it's quite a different culture, quite a different archaeology, but very distinct and certainly as old as around 1200 to 1500 BC. So the earliest texts that we have are called the Vedas. And in fact, the Vedas actually is quite a large body, but the earliest text is in the Vedas. There are two basic divisions within the Vedas. The first is what we would call Shruti, that which is heard, or that is revealed text, and Smriti, that which is remembered or traditional text. So there's two types of scripture, revelation and tradition. So let's look at Shruti, revelation. And again, remember that Hindus believe this to be a flowering of something that did not have a beginning. It was always in existence, but it came to an efflorescence at a particular time. There's 4 genres that make up Shruti. There are Samhitas, these are hymns, chants, invocations, and prayers. There's ritualistic material, mostly used during sacrifice. There are commentaries on those rituals, instructions to the priests as to how to do those rituals. And finally, there are more speculative and contemplative texts called the Aranyakas. These are literally called forest texts or wilderness texts because they often were composed by forest dwellers. The Upanishads are actually the last section of those Aranyakas. So they are actually part of an Aranyaka, but the Upanishads are distinguished by being probably the most philosophical texts of the Vedas. So there's 4, the Samhitas, the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, and the Upanishads. So those are the genres. But there's also 4 collections. And the Rig Veda is the oldest, right? It holds some of the oldest parts of the Vedas, hymns, prayers, various mantras. The Sama and the Yajur Veda, there's 2 others. They're similar but have slightly different structures, some different themes. And finally, the Atharva Veda, which is likely the newest and perhaps probably non-Aryan. It probably included a lot of indigenous material. So spells, medicines, remedies, all sorts of things. So here's what you'll be tested on later. So you've got the 4 collections, the Atharva, Yajur, Sama, and Rig. And all of those collections have elements of every genre. So the Rig Veda Samhita is called the Sakala, or the Shakala Veda, or Shakala Samhita. Then it's got Brahmanas, the Aitariya and the Kaushitaki Brahmana. And then, so all of these, I'm not going to go through all of them. There's a lot of it. Just this will fill out about a shelf full of books. Right? So these are all considered by Hindus to be divine revelation. Who heard them? Mythical ancient seers or hearers, really, called rishis. Rishis were understood to be ancient holy men who were so connected to the eternal Dharma that they were able, through meditation, to literally hear these sounds and to be able to recite them. All right, so in some ways quite similar to in Islam, the Quran is a recitation, right? So some of these, the earliest oral forms are recitations. They're sounds primarily, they're words. And again, similar to the Bible, we've got the beginning being the Word, right? Or God creating through speech. So that's the revelation part of the Vedas, which is dwarfed by the traditional part of the Vedas. And here we're looking around 500 BCE. This is the traditional remembered. It has this kind of idea of the age-old spiritual wisdom, right? It is consciously connected to Shruti, the revelation, in that the traditional material, in order to be part of the Vedas, must be consistent with the revealed material. All right? Therefore, it would have authority. It borrows the authority, as it were, from the revealed material. And it has a lot of minority voices. Even though it, by and large, is consistent with the revealed material, it's much more diverse. It has a large influence on people because later on it's found in the vernacular rather than in these priestly Vedic or Sanskrit languages. All right, so there's not too much more here. I realize this is a lot of material. Various forms of scripture here. Itihasa is the epic literature, and you may have come across some of these epics. The Mahabharata, which is the world's longest poem. It literally means the great story of Bharat, or India. It's about 100,000 verses, and one of the books within the Mahabharata is the Bhagavad Gita, which you may have come across as well. It's sometimes referred to as the Hindu Bible. That's really not the case. If there is an analog to the Bible, it would be the entire Vedas, right? It's the revealed and remembered holy scriptures of Hindus. Another epic is the Ramayana, literally the story of Rama. Both are really popular, right? These are in many ways the kind of living historical traditions, the scriptures that sort of find their way into the nooks and crannies of people's lives. It's through these epic stories, and there's so much of it, right? We'll spend more time in one of the the brunch sessions, so there's a plug for you to come back to hear about the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, to spend time talking about some of these stories. They're wonderful stories. These are very important as well for devotional Hinduism. There's others, Puranas, simply called the Old Tales. These are a huge collection of literature covering all kinds of religious and non-religious themes. It's consistent generally with the revealed material, but because, again, it's used in both Sanskrit and vernacular ways, it has a very large influence on Hindus. There are law books, Dharma Shastras and Dharma Sutras. These are pedagogical and legal texts, right? The Kavya texts, which are poetry and poetical texts. The Artha Shastras, which are the books on civil, economic, and political social structures, statecraft, things like this. And finally, there are commentaries and summaries of all the other texts called bhashyas, right? So enormous amounts of work, enormous amounts of material there. And given this huge body of literature, it's no wonder that you have such a huge diversity within Hinduism. All right? Okay, that's the hard part gone. The more interesting bit are the basic concepts. We've covered some of these before. So samsara is the view of the wheel of phenomenal existence, the cycle of birth and death. All of the experiences that we have as living beings are part of the great cycle of samsara. Karma, I'm sure you've heard, literally means action or making. So it includes this idea of acting, but also the result of the action, the thing produced, right? So the law of karma is therefore the law of cause and effect, right? However we act, we're going to create results which need to be undergone, as it were. Moksha literally means release from this round of birth and rebirth, release from samsara, right? Dharma is the difficult one. It literally means that which upholds, that which is the foundation. But it's the foundation for the natural world, our social order, as well as our moral obligations and duties. It is that by which, or because of which, everything exists and should exist in the way it does, right? It often is thought of as duty, but that's really only part of it. As I said, it's that which upholds our actions. And because it is, as it were, the ideal and foundation of all action, it has this sense of prescription to it, some sense that we are supposed to act according to Dharma, and therefore it has this connotation of duty. As I said, it's this foundation, it concerns ethics, both social and personal, and really you can think about Dharma as kind of the way or the goal of the universe, that by which everything exists and to which everything turns. So, we've already mentioned this cyclical view of time. The other thing that Hindus assume is that whatever is true at the microcosmic level of your personal life is connected to the macrocosm of your community, your society, your country, the world, the entire universe. They are connected irrevocably. And finally, the idea that you can actually have what you want. Because time is cyclical, because you have undergone innumerable births and deaths, there's more chances to come. If you want to spend time in this life, spending all your time towards gaining success, for instance, that's fine. If you want to enjoy pleasure, that's fine as well. Eventually you'll get bored and you will want to have something more deep. Eventually you'll want to follow Dharma. And eventually you will want to get off the merry-go-round entirely, and that's liberation or moksha. So the you can have what you want bits is quite interesting, I think, because there is no kind of urgency within the Hindu way of thinking about things, right? It doesn't mean that everything is as good as anything else. That's clearly not the case. Karma means that if you do bad things are going to visit you, as well as good things. If you do good things are going to come from them as well. So it's clearly not the case that anything is good as anything else. It's just that there's not much urgency, right? And that affects the way Hindus live their lives in really quite profound ways. We'll see this later on when we look at deities and worship and ritual. We'll see this later on when we think about, or when we look at how Hindus manage the modern world, right? It's a kind of safety net, as it were, in the sense that you can be sure that despite all the mistakes one makes, all the issues one might have, all the pain one might suffer, there are more chances to improve later on. Right? So, let's summarize here. What can you take out of this lecture, hopefully? Well, it's not quite a religion in the way that we talk about religion these days, right? It's not about believing in certain things. It is more about trying to follow a particular way of living. But it's not the same way of living for everybody. It's quite personalized in many ways, but it's connected to a broader way of living as well, right? It's a very old, diverse, and ridiculously complex tradition, right? It has diverse scriptures, but the core of those scriptures running through it is the Vedas. Vedas, the term, comes from vid, which means to see. Vid, you see in video, right? And vid, and various other. So I hope you'll forgive me, but all these Sanskrit terms are really kind of cool because they have these connections to other things, right? So Vedas literally means sight, seeing. And so the main goal of Hinduism, really, is for all of us individually to attain a salvific vision of reality, to see the world, see the universe and ourselves in it as we truly are. The problem is, for Hindus, ignorance. That's what we have to get past. The goal is right vision, right insight, right? And once we see that, we are released from pain and suffering and eventually released from samsara. Let me just give you one example that kind of highlights this idea. Imagine you are walking down a country road in Alberta, and down the side of this country road, you see a kind of coiled thing, and you think, oh man, that might be a snake. And so as you get closer and closer to it, you get a little bit more afraid. And eventually you think, I'm not taking my chances. I'm going to go off the road, and yeah, there's brambles and thickets, and it's not a nice way to go, but I'm going to avoid that snake. So you walk through the brambles and thickets, you come out of it bloodied, in pain, exasperated, and yet you've passed the snake. Except you can't help yourself but look back. And as you look back, you realize it was a coiled rope. When you see rightly, what happens? When you see that it was a coiled rope, all of that tension and anxiety, all of that worry falls off of you, as if you've been just woken from a bad dream. And when you see rightly, that anxiety, that tension falls off you, and what do you feel? Liberated. And that's really the goal of Hinduism. Thanks very much. So I think we have time for questions, comments.
Could you kindly remind me of the wonderful storyteller of that one, and Jewel?
Of the
Story that you told.
Oh, the story.
And I forgot the question.
Yeah. So the question is, where did that story of the coiled rope come from?
So it's from Punjabi or one of the others.
Well, where I get it, and again, it might be only one source because these stories get told over and over. Where I got it was from the 8th century philosopher Shankara.
Exactly so.
And it likely was an older story, another tale.
So Shankara, tell me, I just couldn't remember which one it was. Thank you.
To what degree do Hindus tend to think that these texts are written by God or divinely inspired or any variation? Because, of course, in the Abrahamic traditions, there's heated debate about that.
So the text, the actual written texts, eventually get attributed to particular human authors. But that's not to say that the actual words are their words. It's always understood to be beginningless. And so the idea is that these ancient rishis heard these words in meditative activity, literally from the universe itself. There was no author, right? In fact, to say something had an author is to have denigrated it. So, right from the very early sources, or from the early point, the oral tradition, it's always understood to be an oral message, a heard message, which the ancient rishis heard and authorized, but in fact, they themselves aren't understood to have transmitted them. What they did was they talked to you about it, as it were, in a way such that you heard it directly as well. So they reminded you. They spoke in a way, they taught in a way which allowed the unfolding of the same words in you. So in that sense, the word did not actually go through a human conduit. They were first heard by the rishis, but then they are reborn or reheard later in oral tradition. Now, later on, as this tradition became less and less practiced, as human beings became more and more depraved and evil and all of that kind of stuff, it was understood that this needed to be written so that it could become, it would be preserved as it actually is, right? Those original writers are lost in the mists of time. We do have some pretty good evidence to suggest that the oral traditions are remarkably have high fidelity. They're remarkably good at maintaining, and there's some really interesting ways that Indian traditions have developed in order to memorize things exactly. It works well with Sanskrit particularly because it's a very mathematical language, right? If you miss something, if you forget something, it's pretty clear by the grammar of the language that you've missed something, right? It's that structure. And so there's some good evidence to suggest that the oral tradition had tremendous fidelity, that the written versions of these texts were very close to the oral versions of the text. We know some of this because those oral traditions are still alive now. So if you go to particular parts of India, you can go and sit with a priest or a Brahmin, and he can recite for you a part of the Rig Veda. And you can be looking it up and making sure it's close. And in fact, it's very close. And that Brahmin priest will not have learnt it by reading it. He will have learnt it by hearing it from his guru, and his guru, and his guru. So the oral tradition is really quite interesting there. Now, of course, there are some discrepancies. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good from what we can see. Yeah.
I think you used the term stable text. What did you mean by stable text?
So the written forms did have various what are called recensions. They're different lineages. So one guru would have recited the text to his, and it would have been his disciple, and it would have gone forward. Another guru would have done the same thing, but again, because of the way Sanskrit works, even though the same sounds can be done, it's kind of like putting diacritics in different parts. You can actually change the meaning of a term by the way you coalesce or split the term out, right? So the same code can be written in different, or can mean different things, depending on how you cut it up, right? So that's what we mean when those codes kind of coalesced to some agreed way of cutting things up, then we get this stable text formed. Yep.
How many people in the world identify as being Hindu? And how would one become a Hindu, should they want?
It's a good question. So about 1.1 billion people identify as Hindu. Actually, it's probably about closer to 1 billion now. I shouldn't say 1.1. It's getting close. How do you become a Hindu? You live like a Hindu. There is no magic formula. There are some rituals that you might follow to be part of a particular Hindu tradition, but those formula or those rituals aren't by no means are they universal across India. So there will be different rituals used to engage with different Hindu traditions, but they would all share certain basic things. They would all share some belief in samsara and karma and moksha and dharma. They would all agree to the Vedas being divinely inspired or divine revelation. Then you just have to live like Hindus. You don't have to be born a Hindu. You don't have to. You can convert to Hinduism. There are some rituals, I suppose, but they're relatively new things, actually.
So would you be accepted by other Hindus?
Yeah, I think you would, especially if you try to live it with authenticity. There's lots of Indians, nominally Hindu, who don't live Hindu lives, right? So I think if you were particularly devout and really trying, you would be seen as a good Hindu. Yeah.
My fellow clergy is smiling because, well, nominally, we have nominally observant people in all traditions.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So at a certain point, a large group of Indians, people from India, moved to East African countries, Kenya, Uganda, and they call themselves Ismailis. What is their relation to Hinduism?
So Ismailis were a large group of Indians, you're right, who moved. Prior to them moving, they were converted by a particular sect of Islam. The Aga Khan is now the grandson of the first Aga Khan who was exiled from Iran, went to India, found a home there, and converted a number of Hindus. Those people who became Ismailis actually come from the same geography as my ancestors. And so when I meet Ismailis in town here, if we work out where we're all from, we're pretty much cousins, right? We were neighbors at one point. And I was born in East Africa as well. So a lot of those Ismaili families, it's a small ethnic group of largely Gujaratis who form both Hindu Gujaratis and Ismailis. We're all kind of the same people in many ways. It's just that some converted to Islam and some didn't. I have a connection with our mayor. We were way back in the same or neighboring villages, and his father and my grandfather did business together in Tanzania. Yeah. Oh, sorry, yes, first.
I am an Ismaili from East Africa. And
I hope I got that right.
as I understand it, you're pretty close. As I understand it, the bridge to convert the Hindus into Ismailis, the tools that were used were lots of the traditions of the Hindus, the scriptures, a lot of characters from Mahabharata, Draupadi and Ram, and those characters were used as a bridge to convert people. So when they converted, they were mostly Hindu traditions, and of my very small fraction of Islamic converting. Now gradually over a period of time, the Hindu aspect of it is being forgotten,
Yes.
or whatever. It's particularly a sore point for me because that was the religion of my ancestors. So that maybe gives you a little bit of my perspective as an Ismaili.
Thank you.
And I'm the black sheep.
Thank you. Yeah.
Are there noticeable differences in the way that Tamils practice Hinduism?
Yeah. Again, if you visit India, which I encourage you all to do. It's a remarkable place. Once we get south of Hyderabad, which was sort of the southernmost part of the Mughal influence, you get a very different kind of Hinduism being practiced, not only because it's Tamil-based, but because it was relatively untouched by the Mughal and even the British influence. And so you have quite a different flavor of Hinduism being practiced there, one which is relatively more ritualistic. It has certainly more, obviously it's Tamil, but the Sanskrit used in the south is also a more sort of traditional form, an earlier form of Sanskrit. And so you see it in terms of the Brahminical or the Brahmin communities there. They are probably India's most, how would I say, they're the ones who have kept the most ancient traditions of oral transmission and ritual practice most alive. In the north, for various historic and cultural reasons, those kinds of traditions tended to dissipate or get mixed with others. And so if you really want to see a more kind of, not a more ancient Hinduism, but perhaps one with echoes to more ancient traditions, you see it in the south.
About the Gita, about the Bhagavad Gita, that it has infiltrated into Western culture the way it has.
So the question is, how has it influenced, or how has
Why
has
Gita
it?
rather than
Right.
the other texts?
That's a really good question. Okay, so there's two reasons, I think. One of which I think has more foundation, and the other reason I think might be just my own little theory. The first is that the Gita was certainly not, how would I say, it was already a very important text. It exists almost right smack in the middle of the Mahabharata, and it represents one of the key events in that story. It's the point at which the two warring parties actually meet on the battlefield, and they're arrayed against each other, and two people come into the middle of it, as if the center of the universe. They stop and they have a little discussion, and that discussion is the Bhagavad Gita. So it's important, and it has this kind of life, partly because of its centrality in this great story, this really important epic in the lives of Hindus. And as the kind of center point in the text, it holds some of the key teachings of the text, but it's not the only one that holds teachings. It's such a big topic, or such a big text, that you could point to other parts to say, that's really more important, right? So there's some debate, but it certainly is one of the key ones, right? The second reason, I think, is because, as I said, this is maybe my own interpretation. When the British, particularly, came to India, Orientalism suggests that, they bring with them all kinds of scholars and academics and government people and things like that, as it were, to, study and learn about the traditions and things like that, all the while making sure that the merchants and the military could do what they want, right? Those scholars who came to understand this great tradition, again, were looking for something like the Bible. And one of the things that they would go to do is ask, the various Brahmins, the priests, so, we have this central text. What is your central text? So if they talked to one Brahmin, they might have got, the Rig Veda. Another one might have said, oh, it's the Mahabharata. Another one might have said it's the Bhagavad Gita. They didn't all agree. We don't have that kind of consensus in Hinduism. So it could have been kind of a colonial mistake or a colonial accident that they focused on the Gita. At the same time, the Gita has legitimate reasons to be seen as one of the more important texts of the Mahabharata and therefore of the tradition. So I think the Gita is partly a result of its own popularity and its similarity to colonial questions, as it were. The reason why I point this out is because the same thing happened, particularly with another book called The Laws of Manu. And the British were looking for legal texts in order to try to figure out how the heck are we going to rule all these people? What is their legal structure? What is the legal text? The Manu Smriti, the Laws of Manu, are just one particular book. There's so many others. But it happened to be the one that they cottoned on to, and it's the one that became much more discussed and understood in the West, and by reflection to Hindus after the British sort of took it up as an important point. Right? There are many other law texts that they could have looked at. So, historic and more substantial reasons.
Well, let me just close, if I may, by thanking Dr. Burrell for another wonderful and very illuminating lecture. From my perspective, the strength of this program that we have is that this is just not a one-shot lecture. We have the luxury and the joy of having Dr. Burrell with us through May. So by the time we're done, we're going to be very educated Hindus. The other nice thing about it is that we are videotaping all of these lectures. Now that's ostensibly for the people who aren't here that can access it, but actually I think it's for us so we can go back over this again and have it become clear in the repetition. So I invite you to do that. We'll post it soon on the website. So we have 2 more lectures next Wednesday and the Wednesday afterwards. I'd also like you to put a save the date for a visit to the Hindu temple on November 26th, 1 p.m. We'll have a bus to take all of us there, so you don't have to drive and try to figure out where we're going and so forth. So we'll get you the details, but just 1 o'clock, we'll probably leave here about 12:15, 12:30ish, and we'll take you, bring you back, and it should be a very wonderful opportunity to visit the temple. Other than that, thank you all for being here, and we'll continue to learn together. Thank you. Have a good evening.